failure. To discuss the prospects for the Israeli-Palestinian talks, I'm joined by Dan Diker in Jerusalem. He is Director of Strategic Affairs of the World Jewish Congress and a Foreign Policy Fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. In New York, we crossed to Norman Finkelstein, a political scientist and author. In his most recent book, This Time We Went Too Far, Truth and Consequences of the Gaza Invasion, and another member of our Crosstalk team, Yelena Hanga. All right, gentlemen, you've both been on the program before, so you know how Crosstalk rules work. I think a good way to start doing this, because there's so much rhetoric out there about what these talks mean, I think the only consensus is that there is low expectations. So I took the liberty of going to Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and just looking at really what they expect from these talks, and I think that is a good point of reference here. And it's summed up in three basic ways here. The principles are security, recognition of Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people, and a complete end of the conflict. But before that, they talk about the importance of having the talks without preconditions. Norman Finkelstein in New York, was that a good idea? Because isn't that just a recipe for failure? Because essentially what a lot of people will say, that gives Israel veto power. You know, Abbas is just walking into a trap.
Well, there obviously are preconditions for any negotiations, and the preconditions are international law. You can't achieve a peace out of thin air. You have to have a framework, a basis. And the obvious basis or framework for trying to achieve a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians is international law. And as it happens, on all of what are called the final status issues bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict, namely Jerusalem, the settlements, refugees, and borders, it happens that the international law is crystal clear. There's no controversy whatsoever. And so far from having negotiations without
but Norman, then what's the conflict?
The best way to resolve the conflict is simply to implement.
So you're saying implement international law?
The conflict is perfectly clear. All you have to do. Well, the conflict is the entire international community has embraced these common principles for resolving the conflict, and Israel, backed by the United States, reject international law.
Okay, Dan, if we can go to you in Jerusalem, how do you react to that? Israel and the United States reject international law because with what I gleaned from what Norman had to say, all the ingredients are already there. It's called international law and human rights.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right, Peter. In fact, it's a very frightening thought to think, if Mr. Finkelstein is correct, that the United States is a major violator of the very international law that it is being celebrated around the world for upholding. And similarly, Israel. We all know, anybody who's taken a basic course in international law knows that there's a legitimate dispute between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and that's why the Oslo Accord started 17 years ago based on UN Security Council Resolution 242, and it's actually Oslo, in Oslo II, that still governs relations between the parties. And that's exactly why the parties have come into direct negotiations, because international law called for them to come into direct negotiations at Oslo on all of these key issues that Mr. Finkelstein mentioned. So in fact, I think one must be optimistic that even though there are great challenges between the sides, especially for Mr. Abbas, who faces an unprecedented difficulty in the Palestinian political echelons, one must hope that these two parties have come together in goodwill in order to fulfill the basic principles of international law and negotiate directly negotiate a solution here.
Okay, let's go to one of the principles here, and one of them is
well,
all right, Norman, go ahead, jump in.
No, I'll allow you to continue.
All righty. I was just going to go to one of the principles that Israel is pushing for as bedrock in these negotiations, and it's the recognition of Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people. Norman, does any country in the world recognize Israel as a nation-state of the Jewish people? And if not, why are the Palestinians the only ones that have to do this?
Well, it's not only that there is no country in the world that recognizes Israel as the nation state for the Jewish people. There's no precedent in international law. There's no precedent in any United Nations Security Council or General Assembly resolutions. There's no precedent anywhere for such a demand. The purpose of the demand is perfectly obvious. The purpose of the demand is to make sure that the talks fail. But if we were to look at the legitimacy of the demand, let's take the obvious case. If you look at the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs statement, from which you're reading, I presume, it says that we should look for leaders like Anwar Sadat. Well, that then raises an obvious question. Did Anwar Sadat recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people? If you look at the Camp David Framework for Peace, if you look at the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty of 1979, which as it happens I looked at again last night just to be sure, there's no mention of recognizing Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. This is just a rabbit that Mr. Netanyahu pulled out of a hat to sabotage any possibility of a settlement of the conflict.
Okay, Dan, is this sabotage? I mean, from get-go? I mean, we saw the easy parts. The opening ceremony in Washington was all very nice words. We all expected it. Now it's the hard stuff. And do you think that Abbas is a very weak leader? His level of legitimacy is doubted by many people among Palestinians. I mean, can he accept Israel as the nation state of the Jews on Palestinian land, what they would claim as Palestinian land? That's an impossible task. It's impossible.
It's a very difficult task for the Palestinians. I would correct Mr. Finkelstein's apparent temporary lapse in remembering international law and custom, when in fact Israel is the only country in the 192-member UN system whose right to exist as a Jewish state was recognized twice in the last century. First by the League of Nations in July of 1922, and that was affirmed through Article 80 of the UN founding charter. That was, as you remember, the League of Nations recognized Israel's right to reconstitute its homeland in Palestine, recognizing Israel as a Jewish commonwealth, as a Jewish homeland. Now, clearly the borders at that time were drawn, but since then, the Bush letter in 2004 recognized Israel as a Jewish state, as did Mr. Obama. So I think that we have to sort of brush up a little bit on our facts. But to answer your question about Mr. Obama, I do agree with you, Peter.
We really do. We really do have to brush up on the facts.
Go ahead, Norman.
Mm-hmm. We really do have to brush up on the facts. We should also avoid these leaps in time. Dan just leaped from the League of Nations in 1920. He leaped all the way over to President Bush in 2008. He leaped a century. So let's look at what happened in the meantime. Let's start with the basic resolution for resolving. Let's look at the basic resolution.
Dan, please let Norman make his point. Please let Norman make his point. Go ahead, Norman.
Yeah. Let's look at the basic resolution which everyone points to for resolving the conflict, UN Resolution 242. UN resolution calls for recognition of all states in the region. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even mention Israel. Now, I would like Mr. Dan not to point to what Mr. Obama has to say, not to point to what Mr. Bush has to say. I would like him to point to one document bearing on the Israel-Palestine conflict since UN Resolution 242, which everyone agrees is the foundational document. Can he point to one resolution, one document, or one treaty that Israel has signed with either Jordan or Egypt, which recognizes Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people? Now let's get that very clear, and let's resolve that now. Can you point to one document with international validity, not letters that are passed between Mr. Bush and Mr. Netanyahu, and not statements by Mr. Obama? Can you point to one legal document that calls for Israel's recognition as the nation state of the Jewish people?